They walked into those sterile rooms expecting a second shot at life. They never walked back out. Behind the glittering facade of Hollywood's most worshipped names lies a truth so raw it will shake you to your core. Fame doesn't buy you immunity, not from a scalpel, not from a monitor flatlining, not from the cold, indifferent machinery of modern medicine that failed the very legends who trusted it most. These are 12 iconic stars whose final chapter wasn't written on a script. It was carved open on an operating table. 1. Bill Paxton, the man medicine promised to save, then betrayed. February 25, 2017. Hollywood convulsed with disbelief. Bill Paxton, the guy who outran tornadoes, outsmarted vampires, and stared down alien queens on screen, was erased from this earth just 11 days after surgeons cracked open his chest. The procedure? Replace a deteriorating heart valve and patch a dangerous aortic aneurysm. Doctors shook his hand. They told him he'd be fine. They were catastrophically wrong. What followed was a cascade of medical events that his family would later argue should never have happened. Microscopic blood clots formed quietly in the aftermath of surgery, a detail that apparently escaped proper monitoring. One clot tunneled its way directly into his brain. The stroke that followed was vicious and unforgiving. At just 61 years old, a man who had survived every fictional catastrophe Hollywood could throw at him was taken down by something invisible, something preventable, something that happened in a supposedly controlled environment, surrounded by trained professionals. James Cameron, who worked beside him on 2 films, called him one of the most genuinely warm human beings ever to set foot on a Hollywood soundstage. Colleagues didn't just lose a co-star. They lost the person who made every set feel less like a job and more like a gathering of people who actually liked each other. His family didn't stay silent. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit, pointing directly at medical negligence. Not for money, not for vengeance, but to force a reckoning. Because the uncomfortable, infuriating truth is this: Bill Paxton didn't lose his life to some unavoidable tragedy. He may have lost it because someone, somewhere in that clinical chain of responsibility, dropped the ball in the most irreversible way imaginable. 2. Joan Rivers, comedy's most fearless voice, suffocated by incompetence. August 28, 2014. Joan Rivers strolled into a Manhattan outpatient clinic for what every medical professional assured her was absolutely nothing to worry about: a simple, routine examination of her vocal cords. She had performed a stand-up set the night before, sharp, savage, electric as ever, at 81 years old. She never left that clinic conscious. Under anesthesia, something went catastrophically wrong. Her blood oxygen levels plummeted. Nobody in that room caught it in time. Her heart stopped. By the time the emergency response kicked in and she was rushed to Mount Sinai Hospital, her brain had been starved of oxygen long enough to cause irreversible damage. The woman who had spent 6 decades making audiences gasp with laughter was now making them gasp in horror. 7 days later, September 4th, she was gone. What followed the investigation was deeply disturbing. The clinic had failed to maintain proper monitoring standards. A biopsy had been performed by a visiting physician without Rivers' consent, an unauthorized procedure that potentially contributed to what happened. The facility's protocols were exposed as dangerously inadequate. Lawsuits were launched. The clinic eventually surrendered its accreditation. But here's the part that should make everyone genuinely angry. Joan Rivers, a woman who shattered every glass ceiling in the entertainment industry, who endured decades of industry gatekeepers telling her she was too loud, too Jewish, too female, too old, didn't go out on her own terms. She went out because a medical team couldn't keep basic oxygen monitoring equipment doing its one job. She had joked for years about wanting a dramatic Hollywood-style send-off, red carpet, flashbulbs, applause. Instead, she got a silent recovery room and a team scrambling to reverse damage that should never have occurred. Even the fiercest voices can be stolen in a moment of institutional negligence. That's not just a tragedy. That's an outrage. 3. Christopher Reeve, the real superhero. Abandoned by his own body, October 10, 2004. The man who made an entire generation believe a human being could actually fly took his final breath in a quiet New York hospital room. Not from a supervillain, not from kryptonite, from a bacterial infection that his exhausted, overworked body simply could not survive. 9 years before that day, a riding accident had broken Christopher Reeve's neck and stolen every voluntary movement below his shoulders. Most people, and most people would be completely justified, would have retreated from the world. He did the exact opposite. He became one of the most relentless advocates for spinal cord research in American history. He lobbied Congress. He directed films from a motorized wheelchair. He delivered speeches that left rooms in tears. He championed stem cell research at a time when doing so was politically radioactive. Every single breath he drew required mechanical assistance. Every single day was a negotiation with a body that had fundamentally betrayed him. And every single day he showed up anyway. His final surgery was meant to address a pressure wound, the kind of chronic wound that develops when someone cannot shift their own body weight. It was supposed to be manageable. But a bacterial infection spread with stunning speed, triggering sepsis. His heart, already carrying an extraordinary burden after years of limited mobility, simply could not endure the assault. He was 52 years old. He once said that a hero is an ordinary person who finds the strength to persist through impossible circumstances. He wasn't describing a fictional character in a cape. He was describing exactly what he did every single morning for 9 years. His body failed him long before that operating table. What that operating table took was the last thread holding everything together. The world lost someone who proved that the most extraordinary thing a human being can do is simply refuse to stop. 4. Steve McQueen, Hollywood's ultimate rebel, destroyed by a system that called him hopeless. November 7, 1980. In a bare, modest hospital room in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, far from the studios that had made him a legend and far from the country that had celebrated him, Steve McQueen flatlined at 3:45 in the morning. The medical establishment had already written him off. American physicians, upon reviewing his diagnosis of mesothelioma, an aggressive cancer attacking the lining of his lungs and abdomen, had looked him in the eye and essentially told him to go home and prepare to stop existing. The cancer was too advanced. Operating was pointless. There was nothing to be done. Steve McQueen, the man who had made a career out of doing what people told him was impossible, heard that verdict and went looking for someone who disagreed. He found a surgeon in Mexico willing to attempt what American medicine refused to try, removing the largest tumors from his neck and abdomen in a last-ditch effort to buy more time. McQueen knew the odds were not in his favor. He also knew that doing nothing guaranteed the outcome he was trying to avoid. So he lay down on that operating table in a foreign country, having already rejected the comfortable surrender his own nation's doctors had offered him. The surgery was long and punishing, and when the anesthesia began to fade in those early morning hours, so did his pulse. His wife Barbara was with him at the end. He told her he was grateful. He said he was ready. Those were his final words. When the news broke, the tributes called him the last great American renegade, a man who had defied every institution that tried to contain him, studios executives, authority, and ultimately even his own diagnosis. He had spent his final months pursuing unconventional treatments that mainstream medicine ridiculed. Some called it desperation. Others called it exactly the kind of refusal to surrender that had defined every role he ever played. The cancer won the battle. It never broke the man. 5. Heather O'Rourke, a child swallowed by medical failure. While Hollywood wasn't watching, February 1st, 1988, a 12-year-old girl collapsed at her home in San Diego. Her abdomen was visibly distended. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her breathing was becoming increasingly shallow and labored. Her mother made the call for emergency assistance. On the way to the hospital, Heather O'Rourke's heart stopped. Paramedics brought her back. Barely. Inside the operating room, surgeons discovered something that reframed everything that had come before it. Her intestine had ruptured, not, as the physicians who had been treating her believed, because of Crohn's disease, because of a congenital blockage, a birth defect, something she had been born with that had gone entirely, catastrophically undetected, while medical professionals had been confidently treating her for the wrong condition entirely. They attempted to repair the damage, but her small body, already drowning in septic shock, could not absorb another assault. A second cardiac event followed. That same afternoon, Heather O'Rourke was pronounced dead. The autopsy confirmed what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The diagnosis had been wrong. The little girl who had whispered, "They're here," in one of cinema's most iconic horror films, had been quietly carrying a ticking biological catastrophe that the people responsible for her health had missed. Completely. For years. Her funeral was blanketed in pink roses. Her favorite, the horror in those films, was performed for cameras. The horror of what actually happened to Heather O'Rourke was that it unfolded in real examination rooms, on real medical charts with real physicians who were supposed to have the answers. One missed detail, one misidentified condition, one 12-year-old girl who deserved so much more time. 6. John Ritter, America's favorite funny man, killed by the wrong diagnosis. September 11, 2003. John Ritter collapsed on the set of his television show mid-rehearsal. The crew hesitated. This was John Ritter. Making people think he was dying was practically part of his job description. Then the color drained from his face, and nobody was laughing anymore. Paramedics rushed him to Providence St. Joseph Medical Center, located, with grim irony, directly across the street from the studio where he had just been performing. The emergency team assessed him and reached their conclusion. Heart attack, a reasonable assumption, a wrong one. What was actually happening inside John Ritter's chest was an aortic dissection, a catastrophic tearing of the inner wall of the body's largest artery. It is a condition that mimics a heart attack closely enough to fool experienced physicians, and it is a condition where every single minute of misdiagnosis accelerates the damage. The treatment for a heart attack and the treatment for an aortic dissection are not just different. In some cases, they are directly contradictory. The window for survival narrows with devastating speed. By the time the correct diagnosis was reached and surgeons opened his chest, his heart had already stopped. John Ritter was 54 years old. His wife, actress Amy Yazbek, was with him through every moment of what followed. Just hours before his collapse, he had been cracking jokes between takes. The laughter stopped so suddenly, so completely, that the industry couldn't process it. Yazbek filed a lawsuit, not, as she made explicitly clear, out of any desire for punishment, but because she refused to let her husband's death become a statistic quietly absorbed into the background noise of medical error. The legal proceedings that followed placed a spotlight on the way aortic dissections are evaluated in emergency settings and the real, measurable cost of delayed recognition. John Ritter made millions of people feel better about their lives simply by showing up on screen. The system that was supposed to make him feel better when his life was on the line failed him completely. 7. Farrah Fawcett. She refused to let her final chapter be told in whispers. June 25, 2009. In a hospital room in Santa Monica, California, Farrah Fawcett exhaled for the last time. Actor Ryan O'Neal, her companion through years of fight and pain, sat beside her. He later said she looked peaceful. He said she looked radiant. He also said watching her endure everything she endured had broken him completely. Farrah Fawcett had been the visual definition of an era. The red swimsuit, the feathered hair, the poster that appeared on more walls in the 1970s than almost any image in American pop culture history. She could have coasted on that forever. She chose instead to show the world something far more confronting. In 2006, she received a diagnosis of anal cancer, one of the most aggressive forms of the disease, and one historically surrounded by social stigma that discourages open conversation. Farrah did not go quiet. She documented her treatment with unflinching honesty, allowing cameras into her most vulnerable moments to create a film that stripped away every layer of celebrity and showed what fighting for your life actually looks like when the lighting isn't controlled and nobody's reading from a script. She traveled to Germany for experimental surgical interventions. She endured chemotherapy. She endured radiation. She endured procedures that systematically dismantled her immune system while she fought to hold herself together. In her final weeks, internal bleeding returned with a ferocity her ravaged body could not withstand. The last surgical procedure wasn't an attempt at a cure. It was an attempt to reduce her suffering. Even that was more than she had left to give. She passed that morning, and within hours the news cycle pivoted almost entirely to another celebrity death, and Farrah Fawcett's final act of extraordinary courage was very nearly swallowed by the noise. She deserved better than that. She had earned honesty, and she gave it back to everyone watching tenfold. 8. Rodney Dangerfield. Even at the end, the system couldn't give him a break. October 5th, 2004. Rodney Dangerfield, the man who had made an entire comedy career out of the world's fundamental indifference to his suffering, died at 82 after his body quietly surrendered following heart valve replacement surgery at UCLA Medical Center. Before he went under the knife, he told journalists his doctor had given him a 1 in 100 chance of survival. His response was characteristically Rodney. "Those are the best odds I've ever gotten." He wasn't performing. That was just how he processed reality, by finding the most brutal possible truth and turning it into something an audience could survive hearing. For several weeks after surgery, he appeared to be recovering. He made nurses laugh. He reportedly requested cocktails. He delivered punchlines from a hospital bed to anyone who came within range. But underneath the performance, an infection was establishing itself with patient, methodical efficiency. His heart, already compromised, began to weaken under the additional assault. On that October afternoon, the jokes simply stopped. What made Rodney Dangerfield genuinely singular wasn't the catchphrase. It was that his comedy was built entirely from authentic pain. He didn't find mainstream success until he was in his 40s. Before that, he sold aluminum siding, worked jobs that had nothing to do with what he was born to do, and fought a private battle with depression that rarely surfaced in public. The persona of the man the whole world overlooked wasn't fabricated for laughs. It was lived experience, repackaged as performance. He once said, "I told my psychiatrist that everyone hates me. He said I was being ridiculous. Everyone hasn't met me yet." That's not just a joke. That's a man who looked directly at his own loneliness and refused to let it destroy him. He turned it into something that connected him to millions of people who recognized exactly what he was talking about. And then, after everything, he slipped away in a hospital room. No audience, no applause, just the quiet that had always been waiting behind the curtain. 9. James Avery, the TV father figure America needed, gone before anyone was ready. December 31st, 2013. As the rest of the world was preparing to celebrate the arrival of a new year with noise and light and optimism, James Avery, the commanding, deeply compassionate presence that millions knew as Uncle Phil on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, was losing his final battle in a hospital room. He had undergone open-heart surgery. Initial reports suggested the procedure had gone according to plan. But the body doesn't always read the same report surgeons write. A post-surgical infection established itself and triggered a chain reaction of organ failure that his 68-year-old system could not survive. His wife, Barbara, held his hand through it. His heart, which had carried decades of extraordinary presence and unshakable warmth, stopped. To the generation that grew up watching him, James Avery wasn't a television character. He was the father figure that the show's premise demanded, but that he transcended entirely through sheer force of performance and genuine human depth. He made discipline feel like love. He made authority feel like protection. He made the tension between expectation and authenticity feel like something worth working through rather than running from. Will Smith said publicly that he considered Avery a second father. The cast of Fresh Prince gathered privately, not for cameras, not for press statements, but because what they lost demanded to be mourned without an audience. Before television, Avery had served during the Vietnam War. He was a trained Shakespearean actor, a published poet, a mentor who directed his formidable energy toward helping other artists find their footing. He believed in the transformative power of performance with an intensity that never curdled into cynicism. His death on the final night of the year felt to many like a door closing on something irreplaceable, and, in some ways, it was. 10. Lucille Ball, the woman who taught America to laugh, undone by an artery. 8 days after success, April 26, 1989. The sky was still dark over Los Angeles. Inside Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the woman who had arguably done more to establish American television as a legitimate cultural force than any other single human being, was fighting a battle no camera had ever been designed to capture. 8 days earlier, Lucille Ball had undergone major cardiac surgery, aortic repair, and valve replacement. It had been declared successful. America exhaled collectively. The Queen was going to be fine. She was not fine. In the early hours of that spring morning, something that should have been stable ruptured. The repaired aorta tore open. Internal bleeding followed immediately and catastrophically. Every medical resource available was mobilized. None of it was sufficient. At 4:47 a.m., Lucille Ball was pronounced dead at 77 years old. The news shattered something. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Crowds gathered outside the hospital in stunned, disbelieving silence. The woman who had turned domestic catastrophe into comedic gold, who had made people feel, for 30 minutes at a stretch, that chaos was survivable and maybe even hilarious, was simply gone. What makes this story particularly uncomfortable is the timeline. The surgery was declared a success. The danger had supposedly passed. Families go home. They stop holding their breath. And then, 8 days later, the thing everyone was told was fixed destroys itself from the inside. Lucille Ball had been warned throughout her life to reduce her pace. Her cardiovascular system had shown warning signs that her relentless drive consistently overrode. She had once said she had no interest in fading away quietly. She didn't. But the dramatic exit she got wasn't the one anyone would have chosen for her. It was an artery, a failure of repair, and a reminder that surgical success is a declaration made before the real test has even begun. 11. Richard Harris, the Celtic lion who roared until the operating room silenced him. October 25, 2002. Richard Harris, Irish, incandescent, incapable of existing at anything below full intensity, died in London while battling Hodgkin's lymphoma, following surgery that was supposed to give him more time. He had checked himself into University College Hospital, presenting with a chest infection. The infection was real. But the chest infection was not the full story. The cancer that had been working through his body was advancing with the kind of ruthless efficiency that made the surgical intervention feel simultaneously necessary and insufficient. The operation proceeded as planned. His body, depleted by both disease and the accumulated weight of a life lived at maximum volume, began failing in the aftermath. Within days, he was unconscious. His sons were with him when he passed. He was 72. For audiences who encountered him late in his career as the original Professor Dumbledore in the first 2 Harry Potter films, his death arrived as a genuine shock. He had seemed so permanent, so immovable, so fundamentally unable to not exist. For those who had been watching him since his raw, ferocious performances in Camelot and A Man Called Horse, it felt like the closing of a book that had contained more than any single volume should reasonably hold. Richard Harris in youth was loud, combative, consumed by excess, and magnetically compelling in ways that made it impossible to look away even when you disapproved entirely. With age came something richer, a philosophical weight, a reflective depth, a willingness to sit with complexity rather than burn through it. He never became tame. He became seasoned. In his hospital bed, reportedly, he was still requesting Guinness, still making nurses laugh, still refusing to perform dying in any way that resembled surrender. He accepted the role of Dumbledore, by his own account, because his granddaughter asked him not to disappoint her. He did not disappoint her. His death in a clinical room stood in absolute contrast to the scale of how he had lived. But perhaps there was something appropriate in that contrast, because Richard Harris had never needed a grand backdrop to fill a room. He had always been the event himself. 12. Alan Thicke, playing hockey with his son. 1 hour, gone the next, December 13th, 2016. Alan Thicke was on an ice rink in Burbank, California, doing what fit, active, apparently healthy, 69-year-old men do, playing hockey with his teenage son. At some point during that ordinary afternoon activity, his body launched a catastrophic internal event that he had absolutely no way of knowing was coming. He was cracking jokes in the ambulance. That detail matters, because it illustrates precisely how little warning the human body sometimes provides before it begins destroying itself from within. He wasn't minimizing his symptoms. He genuinely didn't understand yet what was happening inside his chest. What was happening was an aortic rupture, the same type of catastrophic arterial tear that had taken John Ritter from the same hospital 13 years earlier. Surgeons at Providence St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank opened him up and encountered damage so extensive that the outcome was already determined before they could determine anything. Alan Thicke died during surgery. To the generation that grew up with growing pains, he was Dr. Jason Seaver, the measured, reasonable, warmly authoritative presence at the center of a family navigating everything adolescence throws at a household. Off-screen, he was by most accounts almost indistinguishable from the character, affable, sharp, genuinely interested in the people around him, fiercely proud of his children. His son, Robin Thicke, called him the greatest man he had ever known. Alan Thicke had no documented history of cardiac problems. He was physically active. He appeared to embody the image of someone who would be around for decades more. The tear in his aorta offered no symptoms, no warning, no opportunity to say anything that needed to be said. His death reignited a critically important conversation about cardiovascular health in men over 50, about how fitness and apparent good health do not constitute immunity, about how the most dangerous conditions are often the ones that feel like nothing at all, right up until they feel like everything at once. He didn't get a finale. He didn't get a farewell. He got one last afternoon of hockey with his son and a ride to a hospital that had seen this exact story before. Fame doesn't follow you into the operating room. The monitors don't care what your name is. The scalpel doesn't recognize a legend. Every single person on this list walked or was carried through those doors carrying the same vulnerability as anyone else. No entourage, no script, no second take. Just a body on a table and a team of people who were supposed to have the answers. Some were let down by those people. Some were let down by conditions that no one could have predicted. All of them remind us that the distance between a standing ovation and a flatlining monitor is shorter than anyone wants to believe. Remember them for what they gave while the lights were still on, because that's what lasts.